In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the static modifier in Java. Let's get started. Having taught students about static for a long time, I can tell you that this seems to be one of the most challenging concepts. I'm not sure that it's challenging to understand to begin with, but it seems to be challenging to retain. So I would encourage you to really try to focus and understand what we're looking at as we go through this lesson. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the concept and purpose of variables that are static, as well as methods that are static. So before we go any further, we really need to talk about what the word static means in general. Well, normally, variables and methods only exist when an object exists. For example, let's take a rectangle. Rectangles have a length and width. But the length and width does not exist until we actually create a rectangle object. And we say something like rectangle rect equals new rectangle. And then and only then does the length of 2 and the width of 4 come into existence. Strings are another example. Strings have a method called substring, and we can take the substring of a string. Like here I say str.substring01, and that would extract the first character of the string str. But I can't just say substring01, because substring doesn't exist if I'm not calling it on an object. However, when things are static, either variables or methods, they are allowed to exist without an object. So that's a difference. Typically, methods and variables only exist when they're tied to an object, but static says that doesn't have to be the case. Let's look at some specific examples, and we'll start by talking about static variables. So let's pretend that I have a class to represent a bank account, and here it is. And you can see it's pretty simple. I have an instance variable for the name of the person who owns the account, and I have an instance variable for the balance, which is how much money the person has. Now, let's pretend that I make 3 objects from that class. We'll call them A1, A2, and A3, all bank accounts. And here they are. You can see I've got the memory diagram, and you can see I've got an account for Molly, Micah, and Noah. Now, it's important to understand, and we know this already, that each object we create has its own independent copy of the instance variables. So when I make a bank account, I make 3 bank accounts, I get 3 names and 3 balances that are all independent of each other. But what would happen if I added the static modifier to the balance? Notice I've done that. I made one change about the class. Instead of saying private double balance, I say private static double balance. Now remember from a couple of slides ago what static means. Static means that no longer is the variable, in this case balance, tied with the instance of the object. And so I wonder what the effect of that is. Well, the effect is that balance is now shared among all bank account objects. Really, it's no longer an instance variable. An instance variable means that each instance of the class, each object, has its own copy. And that is no longer the case. You can see that from the picture, that balance, because it's static, is now shared among all objects of the class. Now, of course, in real life, this wouldn't make any sense. We would not want to have our bank accounts all shared together. We each have our own independent one, but it is a good example to illustrate the effect of having a variable in a class that is static. One of the big reasons that we might want to use static variables is that we want all the objects of a class to share a single value. Normally, when we make a variable in a class, it's an instance variable, which means every object has its own copy of that variable. But there are situations where we don't want that to be the case, and so static can help us by making it so that that variable is no longer tied to an instance of the object. Now that we've talked a little bit about static variables, let's move on and talk about static methods. And we'll start with what happens normally. Normally, when I want to call a method, I call it on an object. So again, I've got my bank account class, and I say bank account A equals new bank account. And now that the object exists, the method exists, so I can say a.welcome, and it prints out the message. Let's suppose I make my welcome method static. So notice you can see I've made that change. It now says public static void welcome. And now that it's static, it exists even if I don't have an object. And so then what I'm actually able to do is call it from the class name. So I don't have to make an object like A and say a.welcome. I can say the class name bankaccount.welcome. And again, this works because static means the method exists without an object. Once we understand what static does to a method, a natural follow-up question is why would we ever want that? And there's a couple of possible use cases. One of them we can find when we use the math class. Now, when we call the methods in the math class, we don't have to make a new object. We don't say math m equals new math and then m dot square root and m dot absolute value. No, we just call the methods directly on the class name. And of course, this works because the methods are static. Math dot square root, math dot absolute value, math dot pow. The reason it was done this way is just convenience. The idea is that I want to be able to use the methods in the math class, but I don't necessarily want to have to take the trouble of making an object. And so convenience is one use case of static methods. The other use case for static methods is something that we pretty much use or interact with every day, which is the main method of a Java program. And every Java program we've ever written has a main method, and it's always written the same way, public static void main. But why does it need to be static? Well, imagine if it wasn't static. If it wasn't static, then the only way the method would exist would be if it was with an object, which would mean that I would have to create an object like main m equals new main. And then I could call the method from there. But how could I do that? This is the starting point of my program. And so because I really can't do that, and the program has to start somewhere, it makes sense to just make the main static, because then it exists even though I have not created an object for it. Before we wrap the lesson up, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and it has to do with static methods and instance variables. And so what I've done is I've made one slight modification to my welcome method. Now, the welcome method is still static, and that means that it exists even if I don't have an object, and I can call the method by saying bankaccount.welcome. What I changed about it was I made the greeting more personalized. Not only does it say welcome, but it also includes the person's name. And keep in mind that the person's name is instance data. So each bank account has its own unique name. So the question is, what impact does this have? So if you remember from earlier in the lesson, I had 3 bank accounts, A1, A2, and A3, and we can see that they have their own instance data. They each have their own name, they each have their own balance. Now suppose I called my welcome method, and here it is. I say bankaccount.welcome, and the welcome method is supposed to display the person's name. But what name will it display? Now, if I said A1.welcome, I suspect it would say welcome Molly. And if I said A2.welcome, maybe Micah, welcome Micah. And A3.welcome would say welcome Noah. But I don't have to call the method that way. I can just say bankaccount.welcome. So whose name would it display? The answer is that Java is going to have no idea which name to display. If I say bankaccount.welcome, it'll call the welcome method, but then as far as the name goes, is it Molly's name? Is it Micah's name? Is it Noah's name? What if I haven't even made any objects yet? Well, then there's no names to display there. And so this creates confusion for Java, which is why in Java it is illegal for a static method to use instance data, because it's just too easy for Java to get confused because it doesn't know what data to actually use. There might be multiple names in this case, or there might be no names. So static methods cannot use instance data. To wrap up this conversation, let's do a quick understanding check. So 2 things. One is I'd like you to identify a situation where you might want to use a static variable in a class. So just think about that a little bit and what a situation might be. The other thing is the main method must be static. But in the example on the right, you may notice that besides the main method, I also made this variable above the main static, and I made another method, doesn't matter what it does, but it's also static. And it turns out that everything in your main class, and by main class I mean the class that holds the main method, it all has to be static. So I'm wondering why that is, and if you can think about that a little bit. So a situation where you might want to use a static variable in a class, and also why would everything in the main class have to be static, not just the main method? Pause the video, and when you're ready, we'll talk about the answers. For number one, a situation where we might want a static variable. Well, there's probably two things. One would be if we want to have access to a variable, but we don't want to have to make an object of that class. That would be static. The other thing would be if we wanted all the objects of a class to share a value. And we saw that with the bank account where we made the balance static. In real life, probably not desirable to have everybody share the same bank account balance, but it was memorable and it illustrated the point. So how about turning to the main class? And the main method has to be static, but why does everything else have to be static? Well, first of all, let me clarify that the main class, I called mine main, but it doesn't have to be called main. It's just the class where the main method resides. Now, we will never make an object of the main class. And yet we want the main method to exist. Therefore, we have to make it static. And it's the same for anything else in the main class. If I want X to exist, I must either make a main object or make it static. And same is true for the methods. The mystery method, if I want it to exist, I either must make a main object or I must make it static. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to explain the concept of static variables and use them to solve problems, and also the same for static methods. Static can be really tricky, so I would strongly encourage you to ask questions if and when you have them.